which we obviously don't want. So the solution proposed here is just to reduce the number of decimals from 8 to 6, and then effectively do a banker's round on everybody's balances while we're migrating. So that's one big parameter. The other big parameter we're talking about here is how the smart contracts and generally everything that's configurable on chain, so the Solana equivalent of chain vars, how those are managed, what has the authority to upgrade those. And we're proposing a multisig ran by the foundation to kind of initially control all of these things. That way we have the ability to very quickly respond to any kind of issues and upgrade the programs if there's any kind of exploits, which hopefully there wouldn't be because we just recently completed the audits. Let's see what other big ones in here. The circuit breaker configurations are important here. So these are effectively a security measure that makes sure that we get alerted and that the system is protected in the case of an exploit. So we can do things like say, no more than 5 epochs worth of tokens can leave the treasury in a 24-hour period. Or, can be claimed from the rewards escrow. Things like that, where we set reasonable thresholds where, in the normal functioning of the system, you would expect them to never get triggered. And so we kind of want to be alerted and we want to have things shut down. But obviously, there's a risk of false positives here where, there is a legitimate use case that's trying to, sell on the treasury and potentially they're not able to until we go and up the limits because the limits were too low. So that's another important one to look at. Did I miss anything major, Abai?
No, I think those are all the major ones. There's a lot of ones as Noah mentioned. There's a lot of them defined in there. You also kind of just went right through a little sneak peek on the audit there. But yeah, so yes, the audit, we got it back this morning. It's clean. We've actually updated everything that they pointed out. We'll be posting that publicly. Rather than us posting it, we actually rather the audit firm post it. So it's not like, where did this come from? It's clearly coming from them and they're standing by it. So we will repost the audit from Sec3 hopefully later today. But I think that's like kind of a really, really important thing for us from a launch perspective. Like we feel like that is a sort of a huge part to make sure that we feel confident towards launching.
Noah, you kind of went past something that you called a banker's round. What does that mean?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about rounding, so like you learn in grade school, I think they told us you always round up when it's a 5, and you round down if it's like 0.49 or below. But the interesting thing about doing that is you'll actually cause more high numbers if you always round exactly 0.5 up instead of down. And so what a banker's round is something that obviously bankers use and tax professionals use to guarantee that there's like an even distribution of things that get rounded up versus get rounded down. And basically you look at the digit that precedes the last digit. So let's say you have like 5.5. If the digit preceding it is odd, so in this case the digit preceding the 5 is another 5, so it's odd, I think you round up. And if the digit preceding it is even, you round down. So it's a little bit wonky to think about, but it's basically just a more effective way of rounding. For all intents and purposes, most people probably aren't going to have to worry, and they're not going to end up exactly on a 5. But if you do, you might get 1 bone less or more, which shouldn't be particularly concerning because these are like really, really small denominations here. You're talking like times 10 to the -6 tokens.
Yeah, and this is not something that we invented. Just to be clear, it's like pretty standard in financial applications and has been for many, many, many years. And it's pretty standard in I think pretty much any standard library I've ever used in my life, like in any programming language, like just sort of standard decimal library that I've ever used. So it was really, really like normal stuff, and we just needed a single, um, uh, like a single thing that's like sort of unassailable almost. Like we're just going to use a standard, and so then rather than having to make a decision on how we do rounding when we have to drop decimal points.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, does anyone have questions? Please feel free to put them in the event voice stage chat. If you're on your desktop, you should see the little chat box at the top right. I guess, like, Noah, could you also maybe give a roundup of some of the feedback you got in the chat and how that's been incorporated, if at all?
Yeah, so one of the big things has been kind of, and this is exactly why I put it into the HIP, is I wanted to reaffirm the emission schedules. So get it, the HIPs have iteratively changed the emission schedules over time, and there are, probably 10 HIPs that indirectly or directly touch the emission schedules. So as we're going and entering these into Solana, I wanted to make sure that we have things exactly correct with the exact correct cutover dates, so that we're doing everything as is specified in the HIPs. So while it's part of this HIP, it's just basically kind of a reaffirmation of all the other HIPs, and I'm somewhat new here, so my original spreadsheet was slightly wrong in some places, but this is why it's important. And as the developer building the system, I constantly want to be checking my understanding to make sure that it's built exactly to spec. So we've gone over that quite a bit. We spoke about the circuit breakers, and I think the consensus is that these parameters can and probably will change in the future as the system gets more stable. Because when it comes to treasuries, there may actually be legitimate use cases where people are offloading large amounts of tokens. But all of that is kind of outside the scope of this HIP, we decided. Otherwise, there hasn't been any other kind of major things. I can go look at the channel. But obviously, there's a lot of back scroll in there.
No, that sounds right, though.
Yeah, I think it's also we've just been kind of defining the semantics around, how many rewards are issued. So, in the case of like mobile and even IoT, there are rewardable entities that don't exist yet, but they will eventually exist. So things like mappers, right? And mappers, the rewards for the mappers just won't get minted when the system starts up. So we have an emission schedule defined for mobile that's kind of defined for 100% of mobile getting emitted. But if you say like 10% of that, I don't know that that's the correct amount, but if you were to say 10% of that is going to mappers, and there are no mappers right now, then 10% of the mobile supply every epoch just isn't getting minted. Versus minting it all, but then putting it into the other pools. So just defining the semantics correctly around that as well.
Okay.
Yeah, and to Gateholder's point, like if there are updates to the emission schedule that maybe come out of the mobile POC working group, these are things that we would update through governance, which would effectively update the emissions table that is baked into the smart contract. Right, and so that's how this would update. Like we assume that the mobile sub-DAO will come up with a HIP that's voted on by the mobile holders, and the emissions. The proposal would be to update the the emission schedule, and then it would be approved through governance and then activated.
Yeah, Noah, so you mentioned that the multisig would stay with the foundation to start, and that would kind of that would change over time as well. Can you talk about any other governance parameters that the HIP sets out?
Let me go look at the hip again, because I think there were a few. Um, so there are parameters here that start off as the multisig, which I think starts off as a 203 multisig and will eventually go to 305. Most of the governance parameters we've just delegated to that multisig to begin with. That means that eventually there will probably be a HIP to set these parameters. So on Solana, for example, you have the ability to allow token holders to create proposals. Right now, at the beginning, we're saying it'll exist basically as it currently exists, where you go through the HIP process, you create the pull request, you discuss it with the community, but then the foundation is the final one that goes and creates the proposal for voting. Not unlike what happens now, where Foundation goes and creates the vote on helium.vote for people to vote on. But eventually, as we stabilize the system and get more decentralized, we can have it so that holders with a certain amount of tokens are actually able to open a proposal up for voting. And even further down the line, you can even start to open things up like circuit breaker configurations or program upgrades. There's a lot of things that could potentially be put under DAO control. But it's, I mean, it's personal opinion, but I think it's important not to take that step too early, because it's hard to come back from something going wrong, especially when you talk about like program upgrades. Especially while these things are new, we're going to need to be very quickly iterating on them and trying to fix bugs, or even handle exploits. And if uh, are bound to voting and things going through a full 7-day cycle, and there's an exploit, like you have 7 days until it's fixed. So I think it's important to set these properly and then kind of progressively decentralize from there.
I was taking notes. I think you put that really well. There is a question from Brainstormer. Will there be third-party oracles? How far are we from that? I see that Hashcode gave a little bit of a response, but do you want to read that off to the group?
Yeah, sure. So, folks listening on recording later can get it. So, it's something that has, there's the design of this is, I think, really important first. How this thing how these third-party oracles would actually work. And is sort of important. It feeds into how they get rewarded. There is an existing, in the economics, there's a carve out for rewards there. But I think that, how these work, what their responsibilities are, does that match what the expectations are on rewards? Like all that sort of needs to be designed. I know there are some conversations on the engineering side of different teams to start thinking of this. But for the foundation, it's a little tough for us to focus on it right this moment, because I think we're sort of in the last we're in the crunch time here for the migration, right? So that really should be our absolute focus right now. After the migration is a resounding success, I think that's the next thing that I really want to spend a bunch of time on, specifically for the to start with the IoT sub DAO. I think there's a lot to do there, and then start to think specifically around proof of coverage and data transfer accounting, because there is a lot of infrastructure there that needs to just be finished up. With HIP 70, and then start to think about these oracles. This, and just to be clear, like this is not a, hey, the foundation's going to come up with a design and we're going to share it with everybody. We want this to be a collaborative conversation. We would love to see alternatives that are coming from the community here. So as much as folks in the community have time to start thinking of these problems, that'd be great. And we'd love to join those conversations and share like our background that we can. Yes, definitely we'll need hips for oracles. And I think a different hip for, sorry, for the recording, will there be need to be a hip for oracles? I think definitely yes. I think it's individual to each sub-DAO. I think oracles in the IoT sub-DAO will have different requirements and expectations than those in the mobile sub-DAO.
Thanks, Abai. It looks like there might be another question from Brainstormer coming in, so we'll give him or her a second to ask that. Thanks. Okay. Any other questions from the audience here about HIP 77? I see some new people just came in. We're talking about HIP 77 here. We got an overview and a Q&A, so we will share a summary of that as well as a recording of this call. But if you have any questions right now about HIP 77, please feel free to put them in the chat and we will read them out loud. Noah, question just came in for you. Did you confirm that VE tokens will have the same decimal places?
So V tokens actually can't have the same decimal places, with the exception of HNT. So HNT has a small enough supply that VHNT can continue to have 8 decimals. But I believe the supply times the 100x potentially multiplier of mobile and IoT means that they'll need to have 5 decimals for their VHNT instead of 6. And so that's just kind of a technical limitation, because the VHNT possible multiplier is 100x on VHNT, VIoT, vMobile. We have to do some decimal shifting, and the same thing will happen with rounding. Although I don't think anybody will ever actually notice the decimals on the V tokens, just because of the fact that the drops are occurring on a second by second basis. And so, I expect you to see a few decimals of VHNT, vMobile, VIoT, going away every second. It's going to be hard to pin down, which is why it's also, I tend not to think of V tokens as actual tokens, because they're really not. They're kind of a moving target. They're just like a score.
I know it's going to be 6 decimals for mobile and 6 decimals for IoT, correct? With 8
Yes.
staying for HNT?
Yes, and we're also proposing that we just continue to call those bones, even though they're not 8 decimals.
Okay.
Because otherwise we need to come up with a new term for every number of decimals.
We do have a question about wallets, but it gets a little bit away from HIP 77.
I saw the question. I didn't see who put it in there, but whoever did, head it to the Solana migration questions channel, and I think someone can answer.
Yeah, that's a perfect place to put that. From Groot, Groot just said redefine bone as smallest denomination of X. Done.
Yeah, I think that's what the HIP says specifically.
Okay,
So it works out.
cool. And Noah and Abai, what is kind of the timeline, like sort of the need for an answer on this HIP? Like, I know that we moved the migration, so does that give us a little bit more time for the community to ask questions about this HIP? Are there going to be any more revisions to this or additions? Or are you, as engineers and as an engineering team, kind of ready to get the answer from the HIP and
I
from
think
the
we can.
community?
I think we can maybe leave it for a little longer. It looks like, people are still suggesting small things to clarify, like, the number of decimals on the V tokens and such. But we obviously would like an answer as soon as possible. So I think it'll be moving forward soon-ish. But let's get all those changes in. I don't want to use uh, speed as an excuse for not specifying things well here.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so typically we like to have at least a week, ideally 2 weeks of voting time for any HIP. So, I think given that we've moved the migration to the 18th and we intend to ship on the 18th, this really just needs to be done before that. Uh, from my perspective, I'd love to just tick the box as well. So I want to just balance those two kind of countervailing forces. So I would say ideally, if we can get the conversations into a place where we have a final proposed HIP by the end of this week, and if we could do a vote next week, that would be great for us.
Okay.
I think that would at least give us absolute clarity on this launch.
Yeah, those are definitely reasonable timelines. And we haven't done yet like a temperature check just in that channel. So maybe after this call or later today or early tomorrow, we'll do a temperature check, get any more final edits, and then I think your timeline feels about right.
Awesome.
Cool. Well, I don't think we need to keep y'all more than we already have, and we're right at the 30-minute mark. So anyone listening back to this later, this was the overview of HIP 77 and Q&A. We'll put a summary together on this, and then we'll kind of just keep talking in the channel about HIP 77.
Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you.